You're watching Jim Cantelon Today Television. This is Bible Study for the 21st century. Welcome, friends. Last program, we were just getting into the story of the Apostle Paul's re-entry to Jerusalem. After his 3 missionary journeys and years of adversity, he comes back to Jerusalem with an offering that he received from the churches he planted for the church in Jerusalem, meets with James, the head man, and all is going well until some Asian Jewish believers spot Paul and raise a big kerfuffle about him because they saw him as a heretic. We'll get to that right after this break.
Why dance when you have very little? When you live from day to day with food insecurity, rampant disease, sickness, and death? You dance because your heart is full of love for God and your hope is strong. WOW has come alongside as the hands and feet of the Lord, providing both home-based care and assurance of God's love. You're happy and you've got to dance. Please support WOW. Let's keep them dancing.
So as we saw last time, friends, Paul's in Jerusalem. He's there for the Feast of Pentecost. There are thousands and thousands of Jews from all over the area who were there because 3 times a year, all Jewish men were required to come up to the temple, Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Tabernacles. And they were there with sacrifices and all of the temple rituals and so on. And they see Paul. And I mean, even though he's better educated than they are, he is a man of great stature. At the same time, they see him as having become a radical. In their view, you know, speaking against the law of Moses, speaking against oral tradition, speaking against the circumcision of their children. And if that wasn't bad enough, then they say, we also saw him bring a Greek, a Gentile, into the temple courts. Now, in the temple, there was a division between the court of the Gentiles and the court of the Jews. And Gentiles were forbidden on threat of death to go into the court of the Jews. We don't realize how great a gap there was at that time between Jew and Gentile. There may not have been much vitriol on the part of Gentiles towards Jews, but there was on the part of Jews towards Gentiles. That's just the way it was. And they're all in a fuss over this, and they stir one another up. And as you know, I lived in Jerusalem for 7 years. I can see how quickly a mob can gather and how quickly they can become excited, throwing dust in the air and ripping their clothes, doing the very same thing now as they did back in Paul's day. Anyhow, picking it up in verse 21, or I should say chapter 21 and verse 30, the whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. And while they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." Okay. The local Jerusalemite Jews, had been mollified by Paul's public piety as James had instructed him to do, as we saw last program. But there were these Asian Jews who had traveled to Jerusalem for Pentecost, who recognized him and stirred up the whole crowd, as Luke says, accusing him of teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, this place, referring to the temple, by bringing in Greeks to defile this holy place. Now, an Ephesian Gentile by the name of Trophimus had accompanied Paul to Jerusalem, but there's no record of his entering the temple. But you know, you've all played the game of rumor at a party. You know, a rumor starts, and before you know it, you know, you've got a total untruth that is being shouted out, and that's exactly what happened here. So they grab Paul and they start to beat him, and they would have stoned him if they'd been outside the city. But when they're inside the holy city, no stoning going on, but beating seems to be okay. So in all of this tumult, suddenly the Roman commander, who at that point would have been barracked in the Antonia fortress. Now, if you've not been to Jerusalem, you can't see it as I see it. I know it very well. The Antonia fortress is built right against the corner of the northeast wall of the old city of Jerusalem. And it's where the procurator, who usually was in Caesarea, would dwell when he would come up once or twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year, to Jerusalem. He'd come up with a whole bunch of soldiers and a lot of pomp and circumstance. But during most of the year, the Roman commander and his troops would be housed there. And it was more of a fortress than it was a palace. But the distance from Antonia to the temple, I'm just imagining it here. I've walked it so many times. Maybe 200 yards, maybe 250 yards. So, you know, the Roman commander would have heard the tumult, but when he got the report about it, he immediately flew into action. So he comes on the scene, and Luke calls him the Roman commander. Now, he's also referred to in the scripture, in the original language, as the tribune of the cohort, which means the officer of 1,000. So he was in charge of 1,000 soldiers, 760 of which were infantry, 240 who would be cavalry and foot soldiers, or spearmen. But they were all stationed there, as I say, at the Antonia fortress. Okay, so he chains Paul. This was protocol. It's like police today. As soon as they're arresting someone or taking somebody away from the crowd, they put handcuffs on him, in this case chains. And Paul asks him in the Greek language, which totally shocked the Roman, if he can say something. And maybe because of the shock, he said, well, okay. And so Paul, who's been beaten up, who knows how many cuts and bruises he had already, he motions with his hand for silence. And there would have been hundreds and hundreds, not a few thousand, milling about and shouting and throwing dust in the air and, you know, veins sticking out of their necks. But Paul had some personal authority, there's no question. And many, if not all of them, knew who he was, and he was a man of great stature. So they silence themselves, and he speaks to them in their language. Now, it could have been Aramaic, which was the common language, but also could have been Hebrew. The Bible isn't quite clear. If it was Hebrew, this was the sacred language, and that would cause even more respect on the part of the crowd. But he says, look, brothers and fathers, like Stephen before him, who'd been martyred by the crowd, he starts with respect. And then he defends himself against charges that have been shouted from these people in the temple precincts. And he gives us a succinct summary of his Jewish pedigree. Okay, let's read it here. I am, this is verse 3, a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel, was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. Okay, so He's saying, look, I'm Jewish. My hometown is a formidable, and it was, formidable city of Tarsus. It'd be like New York City today. Very powerful economically, very powerful as a center of learning, big university there. I was brought up right here in Jerusalem. I have an Ivy League education. My mentor teacher was none other than the famed Rabbi Gamaliel. I'm an expert in oral law. I have a zeal for God. I was a religious activist. I was, brutally effective as a persecutor of early Christians. And I was well known to and endorsed by the high priest and the Sanhedrin as a defender of Judaism. What's more, I was given authority to track down, arrest, and bring back Jewish Christians who had fled to other countries. With brutal violence, I oversaw their scourging, imprisonment, and even their deaths. Well, I mean, that's going to shut up all of the slavering hosts here who are calling for his death. I mean, he had done more, against the way, as it was called in those days, Christianity, than any of them combined. He had credentials, not necessarily credentials he was proud of, but he had credentials that they would be impressed with. So, and he's fully aware that there's no one there in the crowd who can match these credentials. And many of those who heard him may have wished they could have been just like him. But in this case, there was this but. Why had the ultimate Jewish champion gone off the rails and become this radical, revolutionary preacher of the gospel? As he lost it. And Paul answers that unspoken question by recounting the Damascus Road conversion. So, how much time do I have, Mr. Floor Director? 40. Okay. Let me read it and we'll comment on it next segment. About noon, as I came near to Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting, he replied. My companions saw the light, but they didn't understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. What shall I do, Lord? I asked. Get up, the Lord said, and go into Damascus. There you'll be told all that you've been assigned to do. My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very moment, I was able to see him. Then he said, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be witness to all the people of what you have seen and heard. And now what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. Now, this is not the first time that Paul will recount this story. And every time he recounts a story, there's one detail in one that isn't in another. And that's the way it should be. He's not following a script. He's speaking about something that happened years ago, about 20 years ago. And whatever comes to mind, and that's what he says. But it's a remarkable story. He'll give it again, as I say. But this is his defense before the people.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
What Paul was doing here was telling the story of his conversion. They say a man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument. In this case, a man with experience was never at the mercy of a crowd with stones and dust and vitriol. This quieted them. He's telling a story, by the way, as I said a moment ago, that was 20 years old. It's been a long time since his Damascus Road experience. But some of the details he gives to this virulent mob, he doesn't give to King Agrippa in chapter 26 and vice versa. He wasn't reading from a manuscript, as I said. He was retelling the details of a story as they came to mind. But the main point was, I met Jesus and I've been forever changed. That part of the story is the same every time he recounts it. So, as we read, he had been given authority by the brethren, and by that he means the high priest and the Sanhedrin, to track down followers of the way, Christianity was known as. He was given authority to arrest and bring them bound back to Jerusalem for punishment. And about noon, he says, and this is a personal reflection not mentioned in chapter 9, a great light eclipses the noonday sun in brightness and knocks him to the ground. And prostrate and blind, he hears a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Not why are you persecuting the way? Why are you persecuting me? This is Jesus himself. And in the blinding light, this question, was both reflex and wonder. Who are you, Lord? That's interesting. Paul should refer to this voice as Lord. He obviously recognized that this was a supernatural epiphany, as we call it, an appearance, a supernatural revelation of none other than the Lord himself. He knew this intuitively. And the entourage, on the other hand, they saw the light, but they didn't hear the voice. He then asked what he had to do. And the Lord told him to go to Damascus for further instructions about, quote, all that you've been assigned to do. Okay? There was a calling on Paul's life. I'll comment on that later. He had been overcome with a glory, in the King James Version, that would become his sustaining hope. It was the glory of a new covenant, the glory of grace. What a concept for, a legalistic Jew. This was uncharted territory for a Pharisee. And it took him 3 days to recover his equilibrium. But it wasn't until this godly man, Ananias, a devout observer of the law, in other words, a devout Jew, came to visit, and it was then that Paul regained his sight. And the transformation that had begun with a blast of sound and light was now fine-tuned by Ananias' prophetic insight. Quote, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one, capital R, capital O, and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And he had been led by hand into Damascus. He was now to be led by the Spirit into the world. Now, I want to talk a little bit about call. Calling. God has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one. This was a special calling. This was a vocation. It's something that used to be commonly used of teachers, of doctors, of pastors, called to serve. There was something, if you will, bigger than oneself that had somehow gripped one's soul or one's heart or one's imagination. And one could not see oneself living just for oneself, but had to live for others. Vocation. We don't hear that term much anymore. We hear about a career, we hear about a job, we hear about project. We don't hear much about vocation. I believe that calling, vocation, is still a powerful influence in the world. I know, just from my own personal experience, what calling means. I had a sense of calling on my life from age 5. Honest truth. That was affirmed again and again throughout my teenage years and then into my early adulthood. I knew that I had been called to the ministry of the gospel. I know a number of other pastors and missionaries and church planters and so on who would testify to a similar calling on their life. I also know doctors, I know teachers, I even know politicians who have told me in interviews that I've done over the years on various television programs that they felt from their very earliest years a sense of calling. I remember talking to one of the prime ministers of Canada at one time in an exclusive interview I did right in Parliament Hill for a national audience. He said, from my earliest remembrance, I had a calling to public service. Where does that come from? I believe these callings come from the Spirit of God himself. And I would say to you, especially those of you who feel a little bit lost, you may feel that your life is lacking purpose. It could very well be that you have done an end run around a calling that you may have received at an early age. It's never too late to change course and to pursue a calling. In Paul's case, this calling was supernaturally generated. It was unusual. Most of us are not going to see a bright light that blinds us and be thrown from a horse into the ground. Nevertheless, calling has a way of gripping one's soul. And it's truly the case that when you give feet to your calling, if you will, when you pay the price to your calling, and usually there is a price to be paid, when you grind it out and are faithful to your calling has a way of making a way for you. And I don't know your circumstances, but it could very well be, as you're listening to me right now, it resonates with you because you do have a calling in your life. What I would say is just make this a matter of thoughtful prayer, reflection, and maybe it's time to make a radical shift in your life. And often when it comes to pursuing a calling, it also means taking risks. I don't mean to be trite here, but often, when you're saying goodbye to people, they'll say, take care. I never say it out loud, but under my breath, I say, take risks. I don't think the Lord has called us into this life to protect ourselves, to be defensive, to be fearful. I think he's called us to take leaps of faith in the dark, if you will, to take risks that are consistent with what we sense in our spirit is our calling from heaven itself. It's very much tied to vision. Calling and vision go hand in hand. But I would say to you, as I said to a young man over in Africa just last week, who was working a menial job but had a calling for music ministry, it's time to reconsider your current position and pursue your calling. As Paul said to Timothy, stir up the gift of God that is within you. And boy, when you do that, it's like God awakens in your soul and suddenly things begin to come together. It's not easy, but it happens. Okay, enough on that. So Paul's speaking. He's telling him the story about his Damascus Road experience. And as he spoke to this seething mass before him in the temple courtyard, he wasn't giving a chronological history. The crowd didn't care, although later scholars would parse and prune that his written account in Galatians 1 would be at variance with this powerful speech. Paul was giving an epiphanal account, if I can call it that, recalling those moments when heaven intersected with his life, an all too human life, by the way, that to his shame had seen him zealously persecuting the church. His lowest moment had been his complicity in the death of the very first martyr in Christian history, Stephen, 25 years before. But then came this earth-shaking and history-making call. I will send you away to the Gentiles. As soon as he mentioned Gentile, the crowd exploded with hostility. Religious cultural history is a powerful thing. It's not likely there were many theologians in this garment-stripping, dust-throwing, red-faced, spitting crowd of rioters. Few of them, if they could define heresy, would have defined it as we understand it. But all of them could define blasphemy. To claim that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was behind a call to bring Gentiles into the fold of Judaism was just too much. Gentiles were the unwashed, the enemy, the offscouring of the earth. They'd be ruled by, not with, the Jews in the Messianic kingdom. So Paul must die. He is not fit to live. Who can stand this heresy? And so while the crowd was shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust in the air, the Roman commander showed up with a centurion, his troops. They arrested and saved Paul, taking him to the barracks, where he would undergo interrogation and flogging. At least that was the plan. This was common practice, especially when forcing a slave to confess. They assumed that Paul was a slave. And as he was being stretched out for the flogging, Paul asked a question that struck fear to the heart of the centurion. Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who has not been found guilty? Roman law was explicit with regard to the rights of citizens. Due process was a core value. Both the centurion and the commander backed off, and Paul was returned to the barracks. Okay, that's as far as we'll take it this time. But the point is that Paul was living on the edge. And boy, if he hadn't had a strong calling, he would have been the first to scurry out of there and run for his life.
WOW works with local churches in needy countries. We mobilize those churches, pastors, and volunteers in a concerted effort to care for orphans and widows in their homes and villages. Through that strong faith-based platform, we're able to not only provide food, medicine, and crisis intervention, but we're also able to lead these afflicted ones to faith in God. It's powerful, humbling, and well worth the effort. Please support WOW with your generous gifts and faithful prayer. Thank you.
Friends, if you want more of what I am trying to cover here on JCT, you can purchase this book. It's Cantelon's Casual Commentary, 21st Century Guide to the Life of Jesus for the Internet Generation. It's a hardcover. You can also get it in paperback. It's also an ebook. Just type in Jim Cantelon or Jim Cantelon or Cantelon's Casual Commentary. Amazon has it. Most of the booksellers have it, both here and also in Europe and wherever else you may be watching the program. But I wrote this for you, and it's a resource. It's 520 pages, covers a lot of territory, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John, but it's well worth it. It can be a standard help to you as you explore the scriptures for yourself. And never forget, friends, this is all about Jesus, the greatest person in history, and I'm very, very humbled and pleased that together we can share in the adventure of his life.